In 1704, a Scottish sailor was abandoned on an uninhabited island after a furious argument with his captain. He was left with almost nothing, expected to survive alone or disappear without a trace. Instead, he lived there for nearly 5 years. His name was Alexander Selkirk, the real-life sailor whose ordeal later inspired Robinson Crusoe. At first, the island looked like a refuge. Then night fell, and he discovered its most terrifying inhabitants, rats. For decades, passing ships had left rats behind. They multiplied in the thick vegetation until the island was crawling with them. In the darkness, they gnawed through his clothes. Then they began biting his feet while he slept. He would wake to find blood all over the sheepskin beneath him. He chased them away, but there was no way to fight thousands of hand-sized enemies alone. So Selkirk decided to build an army of his own. The same ships that had brought the rats had also abandoned cats. Those cats had gone wild, living far from human settlements for generations. Selkirk began placing pieces of goat meat around the edge of his campfire. For the first few nights, the meat vanished and the rats kept attacking. Then, one night, a sharp scream came from the grass. Green eyes appeared in a circle around his shelter. The feral cats had found the food. Soon, they came every evening. Selkirk remembered hundreds of cats gathering around his fire. Some slept on the thatched roof. Others curled up beside the man who read scripture at the end of the world. He sang to them. He played with the little goats he had tamed. And from that night onward, the rats were afraid to come near him. But another disaster was waiting. The last of his gunpowder was finally gone, and his old flintlock fell silent. Without powder, hunting became much harder. Worse, if the campfire ever died, he had no ember or match with which to relight it. He had to return to the oldest fire-making method known to humanity. He rubbed 2 pieces of laurel wood together until his arms cramped and his palms blistered. Again and again, smoke appeared, but no flame. He failed, rested, and tried once more. At last, a spark caught. The flame steadied and began to burn. From that day forward, he guarded the fire as if it were his greatest treasure. Food now depended on his legs. At first, the wild goats easily escaped him. They were faster, and they knew every slope and ravine on the island. Day after day, Selkirk returned empty-handed, covered in cuts and exhaustion. Month after month, his lungs grew stronger. The skin on his feet hardened. One morning, he chased a goat along a ridge, and the distance between hunter and prey stopped growing. It began to shrink. The goat suddenly turned. Selkirk turned with it, grabbed its horns, and drove his shoulder into its body. Man and animal crashed to the ground together. Selkirk was bleeding, but he had food. He kept careful records. During his years alone, he killed roughly 500 wild goats. He also captured young goats, marked them, and released them, creating a living store of food for the day when age might make hunting impossible. The island had become a kingdom with only one subject, but knowing how to survive did not mean the danger was over. In his 3rd year, a goat burst from a thicket. Selkirk ran downhill after it over rough ground. The goat reached the edge of a cliff, veered sharply, and Selkirk lunged after it. His hands closed around the horns, but beneath the brush there was no earth, only a drop into the ravine. Man and goat fell together. Selkirk later said that he woke about a day afterward at the bottom of the cliff. His bones had been battered against the rocks. The dead goat was lying beneath him. Its body had absorbed the impact and saved his life. His legs could not support him. His shelter was still about a mile away, so he crawled through the dirt, pressing his face into the ground whenever the pain became unbearable. Then he moved again. When he finally reached his bed, both legs gave out completely. For 10 days, he could not stand. His first problem was the fire. If it went out, dragging himself across the ground to make another one would be nearly impossible. He pulled himself toward the woodpile with his elbows. The logs lay close, but his vision spun with dizziness. When darkness arrived, the cats gathered around his bed. Their bodies formed a warm living barrier. Selkirk lay helpless in the center, facing the fear he had tried not to name. He knew what wild rats did to a dead body. In a single night, they could strip away every piece of flesh. That was the cruel truth behind his cat army. The cats were not only company. If he died, they might be the only thing preventing the rats from eating him. He survived on goat broth and stubbornness. Slowly, his legs began to recover. Then, after 3 years of staring at an empty horizon, he saw a sail. The ship came closer to the island. Selkirk recognized it and immediately turned and ran into the forest. Why would a man who had waited years for rescue hide from the only ship he had seen? Because it was Spanish. Selkirk had served as a British privateer. To the Spanish, a privateer was simply a pirate carrying an official commission. If he was captured, he could be executed or forced into slavery in a South American colony. A Spanish landing party soon came ashore. Gunshots cracked across the hillside. Selkirk ran into the dense forest, the body he had trained by chasing goats now saving his life. He climbed into a thick tree and held his breath. The Spanish sailors rested beneath him. They even killed one of the goats he had marked. They never looked up. It was the first human conversation Selkirk had heard in 4 years, but every word was in a language he did not understand. The sailors eventually returned to their ship and left. Selkirk watched the vessel disappear and felt only relief. No British flag had come to the island. For years, he wondered why the ship that abandoned him had never returned. Had there been a war, a wreck, a military order, or simply hatred? None of those guesses explained the truth, and he had no idea that the answer was already moving toward him, carried by people he least expected. By the 4th year, solitude began to erode his mind. The clothes in his sea chest had rotted away. He wore a coat and trousers made from goat skins, with an iron hook and a handmade knife at his waist. He opened his Bible and read aloud as usual, but the words began to catch in his mouth. He had recited those passages hundreds of times to the bay, the sea lions, and the cats. Now he could say only half of each sentence. The remaining sounds stuck in his throat, strange, hoarse, and broken. He tried to say his own name beside the fire. The pronunciation came out twisted. He fought back because the island offered no mercy to anyone who surrendered. Night after night, he slowed down and read louder, trying to rebuild his voice the way he had rebuilt his fire. But his ability to speak continued to fade. Every visible enemy on the island could be fought. Rats could be driven away. Goats could be chased. This new danger had no body and nowhere to run. It was quietly winning. In his first year, Selkirk feared dying on the island. Now he faced something worse. His body was alive, but the human being inside it was slowly disappearing. He had once been abandoned for speaking his mind. Now the island itself was taking away his ability to speak. That winter, he continued to carve one mark into a piece of wood every day. He never missed a sunrise, yet he began to wonder who the record was for. If a British ship ever reached the beach, would he still be able to answer normally? In January 1709, he stood on high ground above the bay and saw 2 sailing ships on the horizon. Their hulls, rigging, and sails looked British. An experienced sailor could identify a ship as easily as he could recognize a face. But the ships were far away. If he guessed wrong, the mistake would cost him his life. Selkirk chose to trust the judgment that had carried him across oceans and led, years earlier, to his exile. After dark, he dragged wood to the shore and lit a signal fire. It was the only time in his life he deliberately exposed himself in order to be found. For years, darkness had protected him. It hid the fire, the shelter, and the man from Spanish searches. That night, he threw away every layer of cover. Lookouts on the ships saw the glow and assumed an enemy warship was waiting offshore. The crews prepared for battle. Selkirk had no idea. At dawn on February 1, the ships were still near the island. British flags rose from their masts. A long, agonizing day began. The sailors could see the shore, but the distance was too great for anyone to call out. Selkirk waited beside his fire and paced across the beach. The next day, the privateer Duke sent an armed boat toward the coast. The figure the sailors found was almost impossible to recognize as a European man. He was wrapped from head to knee in goat skins and waving a white cloth. He offered them lobster and goat meat. Then he tried to speak English. The words came out slowly, rough, and incomplete. He had practiced all winter to restore his voice, but even the moment of rescue could not make it normal. The sailors studied him, trying to understand who he was. Selkirk did not step into the boat immediately. 4 years earlier, he had stood in the same water and begged to remain with his ship. Now he had one condition. He asked whether anyone from the old expedition was aboard. The answer was yes. He needed to know that these men were not the captain who had abandoned him. Only then did he approach the boat. Before he climbed aboard, he forced out one final sentence. If he was not satisfied, the crew had to promise to return him to the island. They made the promise. He carried those words with him for the rest of his life. On the deck of the Duke, Captain Woods Rogers wrote that the stranger wore skins and looked more like a wild animal than a European sailor. The crew offered him rum. He refused. They offered him shoes. His feet had become so hardened that he could no longer tolerate cloth and leather around them. Rogers was amazed by the story, but he could not prove it. Here stood a man in animal skins who claimed to be a naval officer, carrying only a Bible, an old flintlock, and a broken account of the past. Then William Dampier stepped forward. Dampier had been the pilot of the 1703 expedition and was now aboard Rogers's ship. He confirmed Selkirk's identity. This was the chief mate of the Cinque Ports, an experienced sailor, not a nameless wild man. With one witness, the exile became an officer again. Rogers hired him on the spot and appointed him sailing master of the Duke. But the rescue story took another turn. The Duke and the ships traveling with her were in serious trouble. Scurvy was killing 21 sailors. The expedition had come to rescue a castaway, yet on the island it found the only man who knew how to solve its medical crisis. The next afternoon, sailors followed Selkirk into the hills with hunting dogs and exhausted legs. He ran barefoot over steep rocks as if the terrain were flat. The sailors slipped, gasped for breath, and fell far behind. Selkirk waited on the high ground with a goat tucked beneath his arm. For several days, he hunted continuously, bringing back 2 or 3 goats each day. The crew made fresh meat and broth. Slowly, the sailors began to recover. Weeks later, the Duke captured Spanish ships and brought prisoners aboard. During an interrogation, a Spanish officer was asked about a missing British vessel in those waters. One name emerged, the Cinque Ports. Selkirk stepped forward and demanded every detail. With the help of a translator, he pieced together the truth. A few weeks after the small boat had put him ashore, the Cinque Ports had broken apart and sunk. The planks were rotten, exactly as Selkirk had warned. Most of the sailors who had watched him beg from the water drowned. The few who reached shore were captured by the Spanish and sent away. For years, Selkirk had asked the sea why no one had ever returned. Now he finally knew. No one came because almost everyone was dead. Among the crew of the Cinque Ports, the sailor who had been called a traitor for warning that the ship was unsafe was the only one who survived as a free man. The boat that carried him away had been the wreck's only lifeboat. He stood at the rail and stared at the sea for a long time. The voyage lasted another 2 years. Selkirk served as a sailing master, commanded a captured prize ship, helped seize a Manila treasure galleon, and completed a circumnavigation of the globe. On October 1, 1711, the Duke reached England. Selkirk had been away from home for 8 years. His share of the prizes was about £800, money that an ordinary sailor might never earn in several lifetimes. The son of a poor shoemaker returned home wealthy and famous. Everyone agreed that his warning about the Cinque Ports had been right. But the ending was not happy. In London, the writer Richard Steele interviewed Selkirk and left behind one of the few records of his private thoughts. Selkirk often complained about returning to civilized life. He was remembered as saying, "I am now worth £800, but I was never so happy as when I had nothing." Being abandoned on an island had been intended as a punishment. According to Selkirk, those years cut off from the world were the happiest of his life. He could not adapt to a safe life on land. He went back to sea and joined the Royal Navy. On December 13, 1721, off the coast of West Africa, Selkirk caught a fever and died at sea. He had no monument. The promise he had demanded on the beach was never fulfilled. £800 could buy almost anything in London, except a ticket back to the island. Alexander Selkirk never walked across that beach again, but the name he carved into a tree remained. In 1719, 2 years before Selkirk's death, a London writer published a novel about a sailor stranded alone on an island. The hero wore goat skins, kept a calendar, trained wild animals, and read scripture aloud in order to preserve his humanity. Every one of those details came from the life of the real seaman. The writer was Daniel Defoe. He never printed Alexander Selkirk's name, but he did not need to. The novel was Robinson Crusoe, the most famous castaway in literary history, walking step by step in the footprints of a real man. 3 centuries later, the story is still alive. In 1966, Chile officially renamed Mas a Tierra Island Robinson Crusoe Island. In 2005, archaeologists found an 18th-century navigational divider near the island's shore, the kind of instrument Selkirk would have used. The small object he left behind had finally become evidence. A sailor abandoned as punishment survived rats, hunger, cliffs, language loss, enemy soldiers, and 5 years of absolute solitude. He returned as an officer, became a legend, and unknowingly gave the world its most famous island survivor. Robinson Crusoe was fiction. Alexander Selkirk was not.